Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is ATT-webinaari Laakso. I was invited here today to talk about open publishing as part of the Open Science Initiative webinar series. I've planned a talk of around 20 to 30 minutes, which covers the basics of open publishing concerning journal publications. And we have time reserved for questions and answers as well. So I'm going to go fairly practically, review the basics of open publishing fairly practically from a researcher perspective of someone who's interested in increasing their open publishing practices. So we can just have a look at the agenda for today. So we'll start with the basic motivation of, why publish openly in the first place? Why is it nowadays so important to leverage the possibilities of the web to the maximum extent? Then, very practically, covering how the mechanics of open publishing actually can be managed. And then the last part I reserved for talking about visibility and impact, as those relate to open publishing to a very high degree. And I know, and I'm sure many of the listeners will know, that it's possible to publish a wide variety of content on the web, and particularly concerning research outputs. There can be reports, monographs, conference proceedings, but for today we'll focus on enabling open publishing for peer-reviewed journal articles. So that's our main limitation. And then, well, the most basic of questions: why would you want or desire to publish openly, to make your content available for free on the web? And I guess most of us are familiar with these dialogues, journal websites asking readers, prospective readers, to pay up in exchange for downloading a PDF file for something that seems to be interesting and could be of relevance to your own research, perhaps. And this is, of course, a barrier for just facilitating scientific progress and, making the research communication as effective as possible. And here are kind of three key questions which will drive the presentation for today as well. So the kind of motivation to start publishing openly or consider open publishing can start from yourself. You want to see that readers who are interested in your research, the things you are producing, are not limited by having to purchase the journal article from the publisher if that is the only option that is available to them, if they are not subscribers or their university are subscribers to the journal. But then increasingly journal funders are also, research funders are increasingly requiring their funded research to be published openly. So a substantial part of important research funders are requiring that the outputs they fund are not put behind so-called paywalls, that they are made open in some form or another. And then another kind of force for encouraging open publishing can come from universities. So many universities have guidelines or even strict requirements that all outputs should be published openly. And that could be one source of motivation or kind of a force for making you consider doing this. But I think the core question is still, why wouldn't you want to publish openly? I think that's the kind of the simple way to think about it. Basically, publishing openly is something that is usually free, can be done freely if you so want, and it has the potential to increase readership, citations, and reuse of your research. So I think it's an easy product to sell and a fairly low-hanging fruit when it comes to reaping benefits from your research. And there are two main ways that journal articles can be made available openly on the web. But we can start with just the basic definition I'm going with here for what we mean by open publishing or open access as it's usually referred to when we're talking about scholarly literature made available for free on the web. And here's Peter Zuber's definition. He incorporates that most copyright and licensing restrictions should also be levied or be liberal when it comes to open content, but that's of course not an ultimate definition. You know, as long as it's free, it's usually enough for most researchers. And here, the first part or first mechanism through which you can start publishing openly is so-called gold open access. So you choose a journal that publish all of their content openly on the web, or you pay an optional fee for a subscription journal to enable open publication of your individual article. So gold open access merely refers to direct open publishing, so that you don't have to really do any mechanical work other than maybe pay a sum for enabling open access, and then the journal takes care of the rest. And the content is available directly from the journal website. Then the other part, which is usually free and can be done for content published in most journals, be it open access journals or subscription access journals, is making your personal manuscript version of the article available for free. And of course, this comes with some caveats, which we'll have a look at. And one of them is that, of course, what is meant with the manuscript version or accepted manuscript is that it is actually the one which is produced by you without the copy editing help from the publisher. So in most of cases, you are allowed to upload your accepted manuscript of your publication, be it wherever published in whatever journal, after some delay. And we'll look at some of the tools we can use to figure out what that delay is. And of course, in all of these matters, your library is probably more than willing to help you if you have concrete questions about how you want to increase open publishing in general. That goes for all of the content today. But I think already now it's important just to acknowledge that for green open access, you know, the one which is not provided by journals, we are looking at mostly the accepted manuscript, which can be made openly accessible. And usually the allowance or publishers permit self-archiving, as it's referred to, making an earlier version of the article available for free. And this is just an excerpt from one of the copyright agreements I've signed. I think this was with a journal by Springer, where it's usually hidden in some clause talking about copyrights or rights and obligations of the author. It's a fairly convoluted piece of text, which usually contains still the explicit permission for the researcher to make the manuscript version openly available. But fortunately, there are web services that have been created to kind of simplify this, so that none of us would have to look into these intricate details and interpret them with the help from maybe lawyers or library experts to figure out when we are allowed to make a copy available on the web. But this is basically it. Most publishers allow this in some shape or form. And usually the requirement is that the cover page of the manuscript would still contain an explicit clause that refers to the published version in the journal, as well as a short notice that states which version of the article you've made available. And that's, of course, also helpful for researchers who actually find your content on the web, so that they know that it should be equal in content to what is available through the journal website directly. And major research funders, here I'm covering two, the Academy of Finland and EU, kind of have a preference for this green open access. You know, when available, where possible, researchers are required to store parallel copies or manuscript copies of their published articles in different types of repositories, depending on scientific discipline or where researcher is affiliated with. And then another alternative is this gold open access, where it can be published in an open access publishing series. And then, of course, there should be usually some form of payment to facilitate publication, though there are also fully free open access journals as well. And the EU has very similar guidelines in that there isn't really a preference for either green or gold open access. The most important thing is that it's made available openly somewhere. And here, of course, they highlight that the more additional rights you can grant readers or users of the article, the better. And that, of course, usually involves publishing in a gold open access journal, that the right to copy, distribute, search, link, crawl, and mine, those are usually reserved to open access journals or articles which are made open access by the publisher. But either way, if you're funded by the EU or the Academy of Finland, going either green open access or gold open access is fully sufficient. And lastly, I'd just like to highlight what the European Research Council highlights is that they also require that research which they fund is made available through a repository immediately upon publication. And here they give specific timelines for different disciplines. So in the social sciences, it's 12 months, and for the rest, it's 6 months. So taking into account the different differences between disciplines. And then we can start to think about, the mechanics of it. So you're working on a journal article manuscript, and you're kind of pondering on the options you have at hand for how you could publish what you're producing openly. And one thing which you could do is just to look around. I'll show you how soon, for potential open access journals within your field. So that's, of course, a simple solution to submit the manuscript to an open access journal, which ensures that it's published immediately, open access for the world to see, most likely with also a fairly liberal license, like a Creative Commons license, appended as well. But then you also need to consider, if you pick this option, to maybe have a plan for how to cover the potential article processing fee, which can range from a couple of hundreds of euros to maybe 2,000 or 2,000 euros, depending on the journal. And the other option, which doesn't restrict publication outlet as much, is just to submit to any journal, be it subscription-based, open access, but still figure out what is the delay that the publisher imposes on making the manuscript version available is something that you should consider before submitting. Because if your research funder requires that the content is made openly available within 12 months, and the publisher requires that the content is held embargoed for 24 months, you have to figure out some kind of a solution for making that content openly available so that your research funder stays happy and content with what you are doing. But there are good tools for this. This is merely words of caution. This is a great service. The Director of Open Access Journals is a great service and the service for looking up different open access journals within a variety of fields. So you can see that currently there are over 9,300 journals registered in the service, and you can browse by discipline or many different metrics, country, publisher, different types of tools. So you can have a look and see if you see anything potentially interesting here, or journals which you stumbled upon yourself when you come across research from others, produced by others. And here there is also good information about potential payments to journals, but it's always good practice to look that up directly from the journal website as well, to see that the information is up to date, that you are aware of how much it would cost upon acceptance to facilitate publication in the journal. Then another web service I'd like to advertise is Sherpa Romeo, which is then the web service which you can use to figure out what subscription journals allow and do not allow when it comes to using journal article manuscripts or opening up journal article manuscripts. So I just showed you the fairly densely packed publisher agreement that's usually signed when you give away parts of your copyright to the article. But this service simplifies the process so that you can look up by journal title, publisher name, ISSN code, whatever, and look up specific journals or publishers to see what types of delays or restrictions do these journals require when it comes to making manuscripts or the final versions available. That is more rare, but usually around 80% of journals allow upload of the accepted manuscripts within 12 months to your university's institutional repository. So it's more of a matter of figuring out what that delay is rather than figuring out that it's fully impossible to make the content available. But it's good practice to look up a potential journal from this service and see what your options are when it comes to providing green open access. And for Finnish researchers, the UFO portal is probably familiar for looking up the different rankings or quality levels of publication outlets. And even the UFO page has a facility to filter by inclusion in the directory of open access journals, so that you can look up your own discipline, your own research discipline, and see the different UFO levels for various outlets within your own discipline. And it also contains a facility to look up the Sherpa Romeo codes, the requirements for uploading manuscripts to repositories. So you can see which publishers or which journals are allowing uploading to repositories based on different quality levels you're aiming for. So this is just a heads up that this integration is also available for Finnish researchers planning out their publication strategies. And I mentioned repositories already without really mentioning what I'm actually talking about, but they are basically services which you are probably familiar with, either from your own university, you've stumbled upon them, or then from looking around for research on the web produced by others. These are just some examples of Finnish repositories, Helda, Yks, Aaltodoc, or the one we have at Hanken called D-Hanken. In Finnish, it's Julkaisuarkisto, but it's usually a very simple archive for documents that provides long-term availability to content uploaded to them. And usually, I shouldn't maybe generalize that much, but in many universities, the library takes care of uploading to the publication repository, institutional repository, if you provide them the files for your accepted manuscript. But that depends on the university, how much help you can get with getting your content on the repository, but it's usually facilitated by the library personnel. And then there are also subject-based repositories on the web where anyone can basically submit interesting research based on being conducted in a specific discipline. So there are ones for physics, mathematics, biology, social sciences, and these are just some. There are hundreds of different subject-based repositories which are used for either pre-peer review manuscripts, so-called preprints, or then for the final accepted manuscripts. So there's the potential to use these repositories for many different purposes, but for the ones we're covering today is just using them as an optional portal for providing content that is also published in scholarly journals. And basically what we're talking about here, wherever you upload your copy, be it an institutional repository or a subject-based repository, what we're kind of striving after is getting that content discoverable. And for someone interested in fish consumption from different angles, you can see here the Google Scholar results for the top hits within these keywords. And in the right-hand column, you can see the different open access resources available which means that you can either go to the publisher's website, where readers would likely have to pay up to see the full content, or then be led to an institutional repository or subject-based repository to get that same content for free. So by uploading your manuscript to a repository, it will very likely end up here being equal, in my mind at least, to having ease of access as easy as the one to the publisher website. So this is what we want to do, and repositories are aimed to do this indexing thing very good. And one word of caution is that so-called academic social networks aren't really substitutes or enablers of open access by the definitions of research funders, or by just good practices for providing persistently open content on the web. They are very good for making your content discoverable, and there's nothing bad about uploading your manuscripts there as well. But please make sure that fulfilling the fundamental requirements for open publishing, be it by your university, research funder, or just by good research ethics, to also provide a copy of the manuscript to a non-profit repository as well. So this is just to mention that these are not repositories in that sense. And I already mentioned briefly, without mentioning the name, hybrid open access, the potential option of making an individual article open within a subscription journal against a fee. That fee ranges from 2,000 euros to 3,000 euros on average. So it's really not the recommended option by either research funders, your university, or just good economical practice to choose the hybrid open access option as the first option when considering open publication, since you are often and in most cases allowed to upload a manuscript to the web for free with some delay, which might be sufficient for your research funder. So then you can use those 2,000 or 3,000 euros for other research purposes. And the fees asked by these subscription journals for providing individual access to articles open on the web are also higher than what open access journals ask for in general. So it should, in my mind, this is a fairly opinionated statement, that it should be considered a fairly last resort. If you've published in a subscription journal and you've exhausted your option of making your manuscript copy available within the time frame specified by your funder, you should look into options of then paying up for making that content available if that's what your research funder requires. But before you do anything, I would still recommend you to be in contact with your helpful library to ask about various options and mechanisms for also registering that you are making an individual payment for an article and making it open access. And then briefly about visibility and impact. There's a lot of open access advocacy material and materials which studies which have been made on the benefits of open access. And most of them have shown a positive correlation or relationship with some factor. The most studied one is citation advantage. There are tens, if not hundreds, of studies that have been conducted on looking at the differences between articles that are made available open access, open publishing, or then which are just retained within the subscription journal covers. And most of these studies have shown positive results, that it pays off in terms of increased citations to make content available. And I think this follows a fairly good logic in that you're not really risking anything. You're not at least missing out by providing your content openly on the web. You're only potentially getting benefits for it. So it should be something that is encouraged by anyone doing research. But citations in other articles isn't the only measure of kind of impact. I think usage in Wikipedia is also a good metric. And there's a recent study that looked into usage of open access articles in citations within Wikipedia. And that also found that open access articles are used more frequently than their closed access counterparts. So that's again something that showcases a potential benefit and shouldn't risk any drawback. And then interactions on social media, so-called altmetrics. There's also a number of studies that have looked at different disciplines or different web services or time frames. But most of them have also showed that if your content is made openly on the web, it's much easier for others to discuss around it, comment on it, and it's more purposeful to conduct mentions and discussions on social networks when the content is actually there for everyone to take a look at. You're not just teasing everyone with the abstract and the headline without granting them access to the research. So it makes sense that open access research is more actively discussed on social networks. But then, we've been talking about the divide between gold open access and green open access, but in the end, for most purposes, it doesn't really matter, as long as you provide it openly in some shape or form through a repository or a journal. And the only thing that matters or is of importance is that it should be as early as possible. So you're not waiting 5 years with providing open access to an article you published, but rather try to look up what the kind of requirements are for a subscription journal to provide the manuscript copy available as early as possible. So even though all of this terminology puts the divide between gold or green, there isn't really that large of a difference for traditional use of articles, whatever the mechanism is. As long as it's available somewhere on the web where Google indexes its content, it will show up among the top search results in Google Scholar. So just to mention that there isn't really that much of a difference to talk about. But drawing towards a close, I'd like to summarize that though there are quite a lot of requirements, research funders, universities are quite vocally enforcing open access in many different ways and with different time frames. It shouldn't be seen just as an administrative burden that's just on top of your everyday work. It's something that is beneficial for everyone, your research funder, your university, and also to a very high degree yourself. And what is important, and is something that I've kind of come across often, is that researchers, please don't lose your accepted manuscripts. If you have your Word files or text files available on your computer, it takes between 15 minutes and an hour to shape that into something that can be published openly on the web. But if you would happen to be a systematic deleter or lose your files after publication, it becomes much more challenging to reconstruct or rebuild a manuscript copy of an article. So I'd just like to highlight that please keep an archive of your manuscripts if you're considering open publishing. It makes life much more easier, and also the library can chip in and help you if you have some kind of file to work with. It's much more harder to start from scratch. And for large research projects, from the research funders I mentioned, for example, it's just good practice to reserve some funds in the budget for publication fees. It shows that you're kind of not concerned, but you're acknowledging that some of your outputs might be best suited for publication in an open access journal, being openly on the web immediately upon publication. So I think it's just good and kind of just harmonizes also with their requirements, that you are reserving some fees potentially for covering publication charges from good open access journals. And then the last kind of statement I'd like to make is that why spend 2 years preparing a manuscript, collecting data, doing all that heavy work and then not really reap the maximum benefits for that work by spending 20 minutes for formatting the manuscript and handing it over to your library or uploading it to a repository. I don't think it makes sense. So I think it's just a good time investment, a very low-hanging fruit when it comes to maximizing the impact of your research to make it openly available. But that's basically it. Here are 3 recommended reads, which I think anyone and everyone could have a look at, that look at different aspects of how open science, open access can make a change, and what type of different mechanisms are currently at play in increasing impact and economic factors and so forth. So I think these are three ones I can recommend without hesitation. But that's basically it for me. We now have time for questions and maybe some answers as well. I don't know if we have any, but let's see.
No, not yet. But Graham Steele posted a Wikipedia link to a list of preprint repositories.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thanks. I kind of skimmed preprints as a concept. Those are very important, and I'd say increasingly important as the pace of science kind of picks up. That you also make in review or even pre-submitted manuscripts available on the web. But most research funders aren't requiring that, so I didn't put a lot of time into that aspect, but I think it's very important that we have infrastructures available that also make this pre-publication communication and dissemination possible.
And Graham Steele comments that yes, preprints are certainly on the rise of late.
Yeah, you would have kind of logically thought that it would be related to paper publication and kind of the slow pace of science as it was before we had really rapidly publishing open access journals or shall we say a fully digital pipeline. But I'd say that it's kind of inverse, that as the pace of science has picked up, the volume of science has picked up, it's become increasingly important that the preprints are made available. So it's kind of a funny relationship that it was important in the past when the pace was slower so that you were aware of what people were doing with a larger kind of caution, like a warning that someone is maybe working on something interesting, but it's at least equally important now as well.
Nobody's currently typing anything, but maybe we can wait for a minute. Doesn't look like
okay.
I was typing at the moment.
I don't know, Sari, do you have a question or should we?
No, I don't have any.
Ah, great. I preemptively answered your question. No, but of course these things could be looked at from many different angles, explored from, a preference for gold or green open access. But I think for most purposes, it would be good to get the bulk of science openly on the web, and for that problematizing the publication process isn't really that helpful. So I think the basics are good for most of our low-hanging fruit currently.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there are any more questions, so I guess.
Yeah, but the slides will be made available in PDF format and the recording also uploaded to the web, so you can share and link to it if you want. But I don't know, that's basically it for me, if there are no questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.